Hey, good morning. Uh, because toddler life is unpredictable, I am recording these lectures before 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning. And yes, if I look tired, I am. So I'm just taking a moment to get myself squared. Also coming to you from my dad's wood shop, so I don't wake up anybody else in the house because it is so early. This is usually when I get up and write. Anyway, intergenerational household is super fun, but it means that there's childcare when all the daycares are closed. So we're going to go ahead. This is going to be in 3 parts. It's going to probably be a little bit like last time where the first 2 are bigger and then the last part asks you to do some reflecting. And I will tell you that having to write and organize and record this lecture made me sad because I am a media historian, and one of the things that I love doing when I teach face-to-face is teaching about the materiality of the media that we use to pass on textual traditions. And so I usually do this a little bit at a time. So I'll make sure that every lecture that we're learning about a new text that came in a new form, I'll tell you about the form, and then we get our hands dirty. So my CH classes used to call those days arts and crafts days, because I would come in with a bag of stuff and they knew that they were going to have to make something. Or with parchment, I used to bring in my parchment sample and gross everybody out by having students look at it and touch it. And I can't do any of those things, and that's making me actually really sad. And so it made putting together this lecture really hard, because I just thought about all the things that we are missing. So I am sorry that we can't do some of the fun things. And I hope that this lecture and this week's activities will be a way that we can recreate some of that same knowledge and energy, even though it's a little bit different. So thanks for bearing with me on this one. It really did bum me out to write this lecture because I can't show you all the cool things. So part 1, signification, making signs and keeping them. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the history of writing as a technology of cultural transmission, and then in part 2 we'll get into a little bit about how that kept developing, and in part 3 we'll think about what it means that writing is the core of what we think about and teach. And excuse me, there's a lot of sawdust in here. So what happens when we start a class with texts? So we've been asking ourselves throughout the semester this question of where do we start a class on ancient and medieval cultures? And we think about date, and we think about the choice to use civilizations over societies. And so today, the choice I'm asking you to think about is what happens when we start with texts or written documents over oral cultures or other forms of knowledge transmission, right? So if we start with the idea that, ancient Mesopotamians invented the first system of writing, which is what literally everyone says, we have already prioritized the forms of media that we're familiar with, calling it first and implying best. And what's really more accurate to say is that the oldest preserved systems of writing were found in were found in Iraq, which we attribute to ancient Mesopotamia. And it might sound like that's the same thing, but it's not exactly. So I am going to pause here and go get it. Why is this important? Because it acknowledges that there might have been other systems, right? There might have been other writing systems, there might have been other cultural transmission systems in use, but those systems didn't necessarily leave traces of themselves in order for us to be able to see that they were happening this many thousands of years later. So the question then is, if we don't have evidence of other writing systems, what do we have? And we'll get into that. So all writing systems have some things in common, right? We know from studying multiple systems and how they develop that before an abstract system is developed, and that means when you have signs that refer to things and the signs are like the relationship between the sign and the thing that it refers to is not necessarily apparent, right? So a picture or a pictograph is something where you're like, okay, yeah, that's a bird. But a word or a sign for a word doesn't necessarily tell you visually that this is a bird unless you know how to decode the system of signification, right? So before abstract signification happens with letters or words, two other things have always happened first. First, counting comes before writing, because tabulation is usually the earliest form of keeping written track of symbolic information. And that's literally as simple as tally marks. This is a nice Babylonian tablet, mathematical table, actually. So this is slightly more complex than just simple hash marks, but I think you get the idea. Second, before abstract symbols come pictographs, right? So all of our systems of symbolic writing evolved from pictographic writing. And I'm going to use a lot of technical terms, and I want to pause to take this one apart. Picto and graph. Graph just refers to writing. So graphia, graphesis, that's the process of writing in Greek, and picto, picture, right? So picture writing. So all of our modern systems of writing originated in pictographic forms. So that was Sumerian, pre-Cuneiform. So we can see how Cuneiform develops from this pictographic language, but it's not Cuneiform yet. And then Egypt and their hieroglyphic art, their hieroglyphic writing system in reliefs. But we see this in other cultures too, right? The Olmec Celt in Mesoamerica, this is a pictographic Celt. I don't know, I think that's the right way to say that, which has images of the ruler and power on a jade piece that symbolizes an ear of maize, and it was auspicious. So pictographic writing is something that most humans around the globe in different cultures developed some version of this. And then that version often, but not always, got refined into a more abstract system of writing. Or maybe we should say transmission, because writing really implies a certain set of tools. And so not all symbols are transmitted on the same tools that we use. So I'm going to try and use accurate language here. So this is a Chinese oracle bone with pre-logographic symbols. They're not quite pictographic, but they are in between. And so this is the kind of key thing. So this is a nice comparison. This is actually from a 19th century manual about the symbols of Mesopotamia and China and how they went from pictographic forms to their more stylized symbolic forms. And we can see that in many cases, the pictographic versions are very similar, right? We can identify the relationships between the early Mesopotamian pictures of fish And the Egyptian pictures of fish and the Chinese pictures of fish were like, we all know, okay, fish, I got it. And then we can see how those become stylized, right? And then they become fully complex symbols that if you know the pictographic development, you can kind of see how we got there. But if you don't know the pictographic development, you don't necessarily know why this symbol represents fish, right? Another thing that you can clearly see is that the shapes that the writing forms take are actually very much affected by the tools that were used. So cuneiform was clay and you pressed into it with a stylus. And so you always get straight lines, even in your early pictographic things, because you can't drag a stylus through clay. Now in Egypt, we're talking about reliefs where you can do detailed carvings or sculptural work. And then when we get into the writing system, we're talking about using a reed pen. And then in China, we're talking about using a brush pen, a calligraphic brush pen. And so that affects the shapes that you can make using a pen versus a stylus in clay. And we can see that in the shapes of the system that we're looking at. So pictographs become logographs. And logo is the origin, its origin. Oh my God. Its early root word. Its root word is the Greek word for word, logos. So it's a word graph, right? A word writing. So we don't do word writing, we do alphabet writing in the West. And I did not include that in this lecture because it seemed jammed enough. The Phoenicians, right? The Phoenicians developed a phonetic alphabet. And that's where symbols represented sounds, but that came up quite a bit later. So we'll just move on from here. So what this means is that something has definitely gone missing, and that's not necessarily clear to you yet, but if we start from pictures and then pictures get stylized and become signs, and that becomes writing, then we have a question to ask ourselves about what is happening if representational art, which just means art that represents something specific, right? So if you paint an ox, it looks like an ox. It's different from like abstract painting, geometric art, for example. So representational art depicts actual things, and it emerged all over the world prior to the emergence of writing. So these stars are not comprehensive. These are just a handful of selections, and some of them date back 40,000 to 40,000 BCE, and some of them are only, like 10 and 5,000 BCE. But all of that is before the system of writing in Mesopotamia, which means all over the world, wherever humans existed, they developed forms of pictographic writing. The ones that we have left are the ones that they did on cave walls primarily. And so these are actually sites of cave painting where we can see representational work has been happening. And so you're trying to tell me that with all these humans all over the place figuring out how to make representational art, only the ancient Mesopotamians, who happen to be the ones that we identify as our root culture, only they were smart enough to make a writing system or to develop a writing system? Like, really? Is that the position that we want to take? I think my skepticism is probably obvious. So one of the things that's happening here is that cuneiform was written in clay, right? And from our understanding of the earliest media, it doesn't look like it was intended to be preserved at first, right? That markings in clay were actually made and then to tabulate things or to keep temporary records, and then erased, right? The clay is just smushed up again, and then you can write new things on it. and voila. And it seems like some of the earliest examples of cuneiform writing we have are actually accidents. So somebody had some cuneiform clay tablets that dried out, but they're not permanent. They can be re-wet and then used again. And so they had some dried clay tablets, and their house caught on fire. And voila, they had a magical instant kiln, and a bunch of their cuneiform was transmuted into stone or into like baked clay. And suddenly you had a permanent writing system. And it does not appear that that was the goal, at least at the beginning, of using cuneiform writing. So part of what we're talking about is that the writing support for cuneiform happened to be something that could be transformed into a very permanent type of medium. But not all writing systems used that kind of material, right? So many forms of writing were developed on plant-based supports. Writing support is the thing that you write on. And plant-based supports just don't last the same way. So Mesoamericans used the bark of the Amate tree to write on. So the bark, it's a kind of ficus. So the bark would be stripped off. It would be this kind of like mess of fibers, and then it would be treated. Like you have to, it's not just taken off the tree and then you can write on it. You have to make paper out of it. That's actually a woman with a dried orange peel spreading out the bark fibers in the middle. And then it makes a kind of paper. And what we're looking at here on the left is actually a pretty late example. It's Mayan. But part of the reason for that is because bark paper doesn't survive that great. Also, it doesn't survive conquistadors that great. So, whoops. Egyptians had a similar process. They used the papyrus reed, and it has this weird triangular stem, and if you soak it and slice it just right, you get these nice even strips of layers that can then be placed in a crisscross fashion that creates a kind of paper. This is papyrus. But you can even see from this modern example of papyrus in the lower right-hand corner that the grain of the paper is visible. We can see where those reed layers were crisscrossed and smushed together with a rock. Papyrus is also not very durable. So this is one of the only, we do not have many pieces of ancient Egyptian papyrus because papyrus does not last very well. And so this is a hieroglyphic papyrus, and it's much newer than what we're talking about, but it's still not in good shape. In fact, papyrus is so fragile that the professional term for anyone who reconstructs documents from fragments is papyrologist. So even if they don't work with papyrus, if they work with fragments, they're basically working with papyrus, apparently, according to the terminology of the discipline. In China, a different form was used, bamboo slips. So not that dissimilar from the reeds, right? Bamboo is long and skinny, and you can slice it into some nice thin layers. These are not quite as thin as what you'd be hoping for with a book. But then these would be bound together, see, right along here, and that would create a continuous reading material that are called bamboo slip books, or at least by Westerners. Here's an ancient verse. So this is 18th century. I'm using this one because then at least you can get an idea of what it looked like in its finished form. But as you can see, ancient stuff does not survive well on it, right? It's just not a long-lasting medium. So that's why in China, they're let's try something else. And they invented paper. So China had been using paper by about 200 BCE. We have no idea when it was actually invented because, once again, paper does not survive. And so we know this because, I'm going to skip ahead, because we have this little fragment here, which is the oldest known surviving paper fragment from 179 BCE. obviously not good survival, but it at least tells us, we're like, okay, so we know it was there at least that far back and probably much farther, but we don't have the evidence for that. So it's made primarily in China out of bamboo fiber, but then it is strengthened by mixing it with other fibers like hemp or textile fibers, like recycled textiles. So once you've worn something or used a piece of cloth to death, those textiles could still be reused in the making of paper. So just like modern paper, it involves creating a pulp out of the plant fibers, and then you use a mesh strainer to dip it in your slurry of pulp, and you use that to kind of pull out a really thin layer of the fibers, and then you kind of even it out by shaking it, and then you let it dry, and that becomes paper. Voila. But the problem with paper is the same as the problem with most organic matter, which is decays. So from a sustainability standpoint, yay. From a preserve this for posterity standpoint, not so yay, right? So non-stone forms of cultural transmission just don't survive very long, right? Which means we actually don't know. We don't know if there were other forms of writing on other media besides stone that date back to the same period or perhaps even earlier. We do know that lots of cultures around the world had developed representational art, just like what you would need to start writing, right? So they definitely could have developed pictograms, and from pictograms could have developed logograms, or even more abstract writing forms in terms of syllabic representation, which is sound-based representation, the representation of speech instead of the representation of ideas. But if it primarily existed on media that decay, we can't say for sure that it never existed. So this is a case where the lack of evidence is being taken as evidence that there was nothing, right? So we have no concrete evidence of any other culture that engaged in this behavior, and therefore they must not have. When we really can't say that with certainty, right? What we can say is that cultures had the means of creating written forms of signification, but that those means of creating written forms of signification just may not have been as permanent. So that's a thing. Part 2, materials matter.